Welcome, everyone, to our last installment of Paul's letters, Communicating Faith at a Distance. Tonight we are looking at Ephesians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Titus. And I'm going to turn it over to Travis Rogers now to get us going.
Good evening. Tonight we are going to start with Ephesians and we'll wrap everybody up. Of course, the so-called pastoral epistles of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are all relatively short, which is again why they appear towards the end of the collection of Paul's letters. But we're going to start with Ephesians. Ephesians is a remarkable letter altogether. It's well, first, something about the city of Ephesus. We know that it was the Roman capital of Asia Minor, and it was a center of commerce and also of religious pilgrimage. There were so many shrines and temples in Ephesus, and it was actually had one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world was located there. That city is mentioned 20 times in the New Testament. Paul didn't establish the church in Ephesus. It probably existed when Priscilla and Aquila arrived there, according to Romans chapter 16, verse 5. Apollos and the disciples of John the Baptist are also associated with the city of Ephesus. Paul apparently arrived there somewhere between 54 and 57, or rather I should say, he was in Ephesus from 54 to 57, 3 years, where he first taught in the synagogues and then in the lecture hall of Tyrannus. All of that is mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles. Paul was opposed by Jewish exorcists and by a man named Demetrius, who represented the votive industry that was connected with the temple of Artemis there. The Romans called Artemis Diana, but anyway, and that was one of the temple there was one of those wonders of the world. Paul organized Ephesus as kind of a ministry center for Asia Minor, and as one of the 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation, the city remained important in early Christianity and is associated with all of the letters of John, called Johannine literature. And it was a site of one of the first 7 major church councils. This Council of Ephesus was in 431. Now, biblical scholars disagree, of course, over whether the letter to the Ephesians was written by Paul or actually addressed by someone else to the church at Ephesus. There are some problems with Pauline authorship. The Greek style in the letter is very different from what we call the uncontested letters of Paul, those first 7 that we talked about. The sentences are unusually long. In fact, in chapter 1, verses 3 through 14, that's all one sentence in Greek. And then in chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, is another extended one sentence passage. Some languages let you get away with that. And Greek usually does, but Paul doesn't do that. Paul is very concise in his writings, and he gives you just every sentence is like a new idea. And so he keeps building on these ideas as he's writing without some kind of a long, convoluted sentence that becomes, difficult to not only translate, but understand. Also in this letter, there's approximately 90 words in the letter to the Ephesians that do not appear anywhere else in Paul's undisputed letters. That may not seem like a lot, but it's an incredibly large amount of, if we were to take every letter we've ever written, only if we're talking about place we had been or an event we had gone to or something like that, would we see maybe new letters. But if we're expressing our ideas throughout all these letters, the vocabulary is going to stay remarkably the same. But the ideas in Ephesians really do represent developments in Pauline thought. For example, in 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about he's encouraging marriage, but not really encouraging marriage in and of itself. He's really taking marriage as kind of a concession as, well, I don't want you to be sexually immoral. I don't want you to do any of those things. So yeah, better to marry than burn. Remember, that's the phrase that, all of our parents probably told us, or grandparents. So in 1 Corinthians, which is, again, one of the early letters, Paul is, he's saying, you should be like me. You should not be married. But in Ephesians chapter 5, now we see a rather higher view of marriage than we've ever seen in Paul before. In Ephesians chapter 5, marriage is mirroring the relationship between Christ and the church. In Ephesians, furthermore, the church is always the universal church. When Paul writes when the author writes the letter to the Ephesians, he's not specifically addressing this collection of people in this town. He's talking about the whole universal church, what would come to be known as the Catholic Church, the universal one. In Paul's undisputed letters, those first 7 that we talked about, it's the believers in a particular location that he's referring to. In Ephesians, the churches, furthermore, are built upon the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. But that's not what Paul said before. Previously, Paul had insisted that Jesus Christ is the church's foundation. So which is it? Has he changed his mind? Has he developed? Or does this represent some later thinking that is now starting to depend on not just scripture, not just the tradition of the oral tradition of those who followed after Christ, but now we have the traditions of the apostles and the prophets? Well, the tension, furthermore, between Jew and Gentile, which is a very serious concern for Paul in the earlier letters, seems to be resolved by the occasion of the writing of Ephesians. And finally, and here's where we come back to the old bugaboo called textual criticism. That is, the best Greek manuscripts that we have leave out the designation to the readers in Ephesus. Now, when we talk about the best manuscripts, there's a few ways to describe what best manuscript means. Oldest certainly should qualify, pardon me, but the oldest manuscripts are just fragments. I mean, the earliest fragments that we have, which probably come from about 70 or 75 years after the writing, is just a small little fragment of papyrus that I don't even think it has any complete verses on it. It's all verse breaks where the papyrus has crumbled off to the side. So oldest, yeah, that's good. But we're also talking about best being most complete, and also what is in the largest agreement. So if we have, say, I'm throwing out a number, 10 manuscripts that may not be very old, but they are in agreement with each other, that's pretty good. But one of the most remarkable aspects as to something is better or not is the construction of the argument, or the construction even of the sentence written in Greek. a lot of people think the simplest explanation is the best. Well, okay, we call that Occam's razor, based on William of Ockham, who said that all things being equal, the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. That's true in terms of logic, maybe, but it's not always proven to be true in terms of textual criticism. When you're looking at a text, sometimes a later writer will try to explain away the difficulties of the text, whereas the original, or at least the earlier writings, are going to sometimes be a little more difficult because they're expressing a difficult idea. The fact is that the earliest text we have of a complete New Testament isn't an original, which we call an autograph. It's not even a copy of an autograph. It's not even a copy of a copy. It's not a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. Now, when you start looking at copying text, and sometimes there's a whole issue about trying to copy one document to another, that certain things happen. Here's the first problem, is that when you're dealing with Greek, that they don't have all the sentences or place names or proper names beginning with a capital. Nope. They're either written all in lowercase Greek script called uncials, or they're all written in uppercase, all caps, which in modern day internet speak would be like Paul was shouting at everybody. But those are, and the copies weren't always written by a scribe. Sometimes it's just the person in the congregation who might be able to best copy symbols and signs. Sometimes it appears that they may have even been illiterate. It's just they were good at copying that. Now, here's the problem also, is that when you're making a copy of a document, if the word at the end of the sentence or at the end of the line is the same line or is the same word that finishes the next line, okay, think the quick brown dog jumped over the lazy fox. And then the next line is, but that brown dog turned around and decided to catch that fox. Both lines end with fox. So here's a fancy word, it's called parablasis. That when your eye goes back, you see the word fox, and it may be the second line that your eye goes back to. And so you start writing from what would have been the third line down. So many times, entire lines, entire sentences would be lost in the different translation, or not translations, the different copies that were going on. Okay, I'm making a lot of noise about the difficulties of textual criticism, but that's what we're dealing with. And that's why sometimes we can find certain things in certain manuscripts that don't appear in others. A guy named Bart Ehrman, he's a professor of New Testament studies, or I think he's called professor of biblical studies. He has on his wall a facsimile copy of a old manuscript where it becomes clear, or it has been made clear, that on the original parchment there was an erasure that was made. And then sometime later, another scribe comes along and sees that it's an erasure and actually compares the text with another manuscript and erases the erasure and writes back in the original word, or what he thinks is the original word. And then he actually writes in the, I wish I'd have made a copy of that and put it up, but he writes in the margin, fool and knave, leave the original text alone. So clearly, and that was probably about the year 700 when the commentator in the margin wrote that. So by 700, and we have many, many manuscripts from that time, 3,500, I think. There's a lot of differences in between. In fact, here's the thing, that there is no two manuscripts that are completely identical. But having said that, that 98% of the texts are in agreement in one way or another. So what we do have is troublesome sometimes, but it also helps us to determine that, you know what, too many things about this don't correspond to the things we do know, like about Paul, for example. So the letter to the Ephesians, while it really does represent Paul's thinking, it doesn't represent Paul's writing.
Travis, I did find a Google search of that image if you want it.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Put that up then.
Okay. So hopefully this shares well to everybody. Are you seeing it?
There it is. There it is. Nicely done, Pastor Elizabeth. All right. Yeah. Fool and knave, leave the old reading and do not change it.
So you can see there in the middle columns, right? Like.
Yep, right there. That's funny.
Right. Perfect.
Cool.
I'll share, I don't know if it's shared to the recording, so I'll share a link to it when we do the posting later. But
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, where were we? So whether or not this is authentically Pauline, it represents Paul's thoughts, probably not his writings. There are some reputable scholars who still maintain that Paul wrote this letter, arguing that Ephesians was written at the end of Paul's life. They propose that the thought here represents a mature Paul. His development of a Christian leader accounts for the differences from the early leaders, early letters. Sorry. And still others who do not think Paul wrote Ephesians do think that it really is representative of Paul's thinking, in the sense that they explain that it was apparently students and followers of Paul who were preserving and applying Paul's teachings to this need, this new description of what the church looks like, not just the local church. For them, Ephesians is here's that fancy word, pseudonymous, simply meaning the name was applied to the document. A pseudonymous work applying Paul's name to the letter, even though he didn't write it, but it remains in the Pauline tradition. Ephesians might have been written intentionally as a summary of Paul's thought. That's a very good point, because when you wind up looking through Paul addresses so many great issues in there. He talks about family issues. He talks about societal issues. He certainly talks about the community of the church. So maybe they were looking to honor and preserve Paul's ideas, to use his authority. And so his disciples, his students, scribes, wrote books in his name. In the case of Ephesians, some say that it was written as late as 85. And so a disciple, 85 AD, a disciple of Paul may have written this in Paul's name to reflect Paul's thought, and like I said, to apply it to new situation. 85, I think, is for me much too late. I think it represents a passage, like we said, a summary of Paul's wisdom, passing that on to a universal audience. The text of Ephesians indicates that Paul is imprisoned, and so he sends Tychicus to the recipients to share news of Paul and to encourage them. The writer and the recipients are seemingly unknown to each other, which is unlikely because remember, Paul spent 3 years there. Ancient witnesses to the letter's designation, being Ephesus, also don't agree. Irenaeus, he was a great writer of the 2nd century. Irenaeus had been a student of Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, who had been a student of John. In fact, Irenaeus even reports sitting at the knees of John when he was a youngster and hearing John teach. Anyway, Irenaeus, an early scholar and Christian theologian, says, yep, it was sent to Ephesus. Marcion indicates that the letter was written to the Laodiceans. And in 1654, Archbishop Usher proposed that Ephesians was in fact an encyclical letter, meaning addressed to many churches, as many who could possibly hear it, to be circulated among all the Gentile Christians, with a blank left to insert where the city is. So it's kind of like you get the letter and there's a blank and you write in Laodicea, Ephesus, Thyatira, Thessalonica, any place like that. That's not a bad thought. Many scholars tend to hold that position. And again, it does take on the aspect of addressing the universal church. Anyway, regardless of who wrote Ephesians and to whom it was addressed, the letter is, like I said, thoroughly Pauline in its theology. The ethics suggest that it was written to a church in Asia Minor. There are certain things, certain mores that are specific to certain geographical regions, and Ephesians is that way. The writer, whomever the writer was, knew about the letter to the Colossians and other Pauline letters pretty thoroughly because they are repeated there. Again, that would cause some to say, well, it was somebody who had those letters at their disposal and was able to piece together this summary of Paul's thoughts based on previous letters. That's fine. The author who wrote Ephesians is also, it's written in a style that's appropriate to the worship setting in which the letter is supposed to be read out loud. Remember, Paul's letters were meant to be read aloud to the congregation. Now, the main theme of Ephesians is God's plan to reconcile Jews and Gentiles, and this is accomplished through the death and resurrection of Jesus. The author's vision, like we said, is a universal one. The writer understands that God's final purpose is not only human reconciliation, but also unity and harmony in the universe. The church, with Christ as its head, is the means of accomplishing that purpose. The prayerful liturgical style is very appropriate to this really high theology. Ephesians resembles the kind of a speech that someone in the ancient world might hear at a festival or at an honorary dinner that was praising someone for his or her gifts and strengths. This kind of praise in this letter is addressed to God. And it's characteristic of the later Pauline works and incorporates traditional materials such as hymn fragments. Paul does that a lot. A lot of the most eloquent writings in Paul sometimes we find out actually were hymns sung in the church or chanted in the church. He also uses the vice and virtue lists, kind of like, fruits of the spirit, works of the flesh, all like that, and a household code. So Ephesians, we can judge, is completely Pauline in its thinking. It really doesn't matter if Paul actually penned the letter himself or dictated the letter. In fact, he probably didn't. It probably is the go-to letter for people who want to talk about the household and talk about the community of faith, because it's all spelled out very well in that letter. Now, the next letter is the first of the so-called pastoral letters, and it's the first letter that was addressed to Timothy. First and Second Timothy and Titus, those are the pastoral letters, and the longest of these is First Timothy. It's a letter of encouragement and exhortation that's designed to combat the dissident teachings of insiders and the suspicion of some outsiders, again, at Ephesus. Ephesus, once again, becomes the scenario for this. The letter is full of conventional philosophical attacks, commendations on exemplary behavior, irreproachable behavior, and images of the church as being the household of God. Like the other pastoral letters, First Timothy regards any deviation from its own counsel to be false teaching. Basically, here's the truth. What I've told you is the truth, and anybody who disagrees is a false teacher. Also, like the others, it always advocates respectable behavior in the church and beyond the church to enhance the church's mission and image in the larger world. Like Titus, the letter to Titus, the letter also gives qualifications for church leaders and draws pretty heavily on household management codes to define the relations of the members to one another. While First Timothy is, again, traditionally attributed to Paul, the letter's statement that Paul left Timothy behind in Ephesus doesn't find support in the Acts of the Apostles, especially chapter 19, verse 22. So, which was it then? Is the Acts correct, or is this letter correct? Well, if Luke were in fact the author of the Acts of the Apostles, he certainly would have known. And so this becomes the first of the red flags about, did Paul write this particular letter? In order to support Paul's authorship, there are some scholars who have proposed that maybe Paul had a second career after his Roman imprisonment. Remember, the book of Acts ends with Paul being in prison, preaching to everybody who would come to see him. The theory among some of these scholars is that Paul didn't meet his fate after that imprisonment, but rather was released and traveled on again for another couple of years. Well, if that's the case, then the letter can be dated somewhere in 62, probably 62. This would mean that Paul was released from his imprisonment before his ultimate execution in Rome. As for me, I think that's a preposterous idea. Certainly because the author of the Acts of the Apostles would have known about it and wouldn't have concluded the story with Paul under house arrest and no end to the story yet. Certainly there would have been more to tell of a second career. Rather, Acts leaves Paul in prison and ends the story before Paul's ultimate fate. And the events that are related in the story are just before Paul's death, which occurs in 64, we know. If Paul did not write this letter, on the other hand, the date is pretty uncertain. I would estimate to move the letter, that for some who want to move the letter as late as the year 80 AD is also too late and incorrect. I think that the letter was probably circulated almost immediately after Paul's death, maybe as early as 64. It could have been a couple of years after that. So the supposed recipient of the letter is, of course, Timothy. The Acts of the Apostles depicts Timothy as a resident of Lystra in Southeast Asia Minor, and the son of a Gentile farmer and a Jewish Christian mother. In other letters, Paul himself praises Timothy as one of his most trustworthy co-workers and representatives, emissaries. If the letter is pseudonymous, there's that word again, or written by someone using Paul's name, the name Timothy may simply represent someone of a later generation entrusted with the responsibility of carrying on Paul's theology, his legacy, and doing that with care and accuracy. Pardon me. But let's be very clear about the teachings of 1 Timothy. Textually, it doesn't look like Paul. Again, I think in 1 Timothy, there are something like 53 words that do not occur in any other of the letters that bear Paul's name. But it's the teachings in 1 Timothy that become pretty troublesome, to me anyway. In chapter 1, he warns against false teachers, and we don't know exactly who those teachers are. And he uses the word instruct, which in Greek is a rather technical military term, which indicates the author's authority to give orders and to expect those orders to be followed. That's not like Paul. He gives counsel, absolutely, but that particular Greek word instruct is a little bit harsher than we've ever seen in any of other letters from Paul. Then in verses 8 through 10, still chapter 1, he talks about teachers who are inept teachers of the law. He goes on to talk about the law being good, but that's not what the Greek really says. It's actually kind of a pun. The Greek phrase there says that the law is lawful. Okay. So it's not saying it's blue. That's not a value statement. I mean, sorry, I just was thinking of something. It's like saying that the blue sky is bluish, right? So the law is lawful. So it's not complimentary. It's not a value statement, like I said. It's Paul simply saying the law is what it is. Yeah, it's a pun that Paul's not that great at using puns like that. He doesn't do that a whole lot. In fact, he doesn't do it really anywhere else. And it's in direct contradiction to Paul's undisputed teaching in Galatians. Remember, when we talked about Galatians, Paul is talking about what is the law? The law was a school teacher. It was simply to show you that you can't do it on your own. But here, the way this is reading is it's looking like, okay, teaching the law, that's okay, that the law can be good. That goes against Paul's undisputed teaching. And chapter 2 is the most troubling portion of 1 Timothy. While it's couched in language about prayer and worship, verses 8 through 15 are, frankly, an open attack on the leadership of women in the church. It describes how women should dress and adorn themselves, or not adorn themselves, and focuses on a woman's good works as reflective of reverence for God. But it's verses 10 and 11 of verses 11 and 12 of chapter 2 that are the most egregious attacks. Paul says, let a woman learn. It's so difficult. I have a hard time even quoting this because it's just, yeah. Let a woman learn in silence with full permission. Nicole, you hearing that?
Submission.
Oh, submission, sorry. With full submission. Permission. Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I'm gonna put that on a plaque and hang that in the living room. He says, I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. Wow. The author, and I will refuse to say Paul from here on out, then goes on to this rather misogynistic and nonsensical rationale that the woman will be saved through childbearing, as long as they keep the faith in holiness and modesty. This is a ridiculous phrase. And this is not the same writer who called Junia a fellow apostle or referred to Priscilla as a co-worker with him in Christ. So either Paul has a drastic change in attitude towards women, or this is not Paul. I tend to fall with the latter. It goes on to discuss the qualifications of bishops and deacons. And once again, it would be amazing if Paul wrote these qualifications, because Paul himself does not meet those qualifications. Modern scholars tend to all agree that there is really no way Paul writes this letter to Timothy. For reasons I just explained, I tend to agree. In Titus, now, instead of going the ordinary 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, we're going in the suspected order of authorship. Titus, I suspect, comes next. Like 1 Timothy, the letter to Titus insists on sound doctrine and combats false teachings, rejoices in traditional hymns and ideas, and expresses a strong interest in making converts. Over and over again, this letter emphasizes a concern for the unsaved and sees the good work of believers as part of God's redemptive plans for the whole world. It's also the shortest of the so-called, the three so-called pastoral epistles. It does not discuss deacons, nor does it understand elders and bishops as being two distinctive groups. In 1 Timothy, that we just talked about, the author is separating bishops and overseers and elders as being separate groups. But that's not the case here in Titus. In Titus, the letter also seems to indicate that the Christian community in Crete is relatively young. Crete. Well, the letter is addressed to Titus, one of Paul's associates and a key mediator of Paul's quarrelsome relationships with the Corinthians. Paul's authorship of the letter to Titus has been debated for centuries because other letters by Paul never mentions Crete. The Acts of the Apostles places him there only as a prisoner on the way to Rome and is silent about Titus's whereabouts during Paul's brief passage through Crete. If Paul did write the letter, then it should be dated in the early 60s during, or if you believe the after Roman imprisonment. If he did not write it, and I believe that he did not, based on Acts chapter 20, where Paul does not expect to come back to the East after his Roman imprisonment. Then, in that case, the letter's date is uncertain. But there's good reason to believe that it was written by one of Paul's associates, one of his students or followers or disciples, or someone writing rather in Paul's name, somewhere around the year 66, maybe 67. 2 Timothy. The second letter to Timothy was addressed to his assistant, and it's a real letter containing exhortations and attacks on enemies, and takes the tone kind of a last testament, really. The exhortations commend the recipient of the letter, we'll say Timothy, to an unashamed commitment of the gospel and to potential suffering that such commitment brings. The political flourish, which is sprinkled freely throughout the letter, provides kind of dramatic examples that contrast false teachings with true teachings. False teachers with true ones. The testamentary tone of it really is really very moving, and it creates the letter into or shapes the letter into a kind of a final message of warning and challenge from one teacher to the successor. While the letter is considered one of the pastoral letters because it kind of follows the same kind of logic or argument, arguing against false teaching, it does not discuss church order as do 1 Timothy and Titus. Presumably, the setting is again in a prison, but even that seems a little bit different. We don't have any details given about the place of imprisonment. The letter assumes that the author had two defense trials, one in which he was acquitted, and the other one, which has occasioned the writing of this letter, in which he's expected not to be released. That supposition is difficult to place within the timeline of Paul's career, which is reflected in his undisputed letters and in the Acts of the Apostles. First, consider 2 Timothy. We consider 2 Timothy to be one of those pseudonymous writings, and I agree, making the date of it pretty uncertain. If the legendary account of Paul having two imprisonments in Rome were true, then we would have to have a date of 63 or 64. But that legend does not hold up, and a date of sometime after 66 is probably correct. For this reason, the author of the letter uses Paul as the writer, Timothy as the recipient, and no matter what the historical circumstances of the author and the audience may be, Paul is simply taken as again, it's almost taken like the letter that Paul never got to write, this last testament. Now, so we've spent this last session and these last few letters talking about this so-called Deutero-Pauline letters, these letters that are not authentic to Paul. And I firmly believe that they are not. There are too many issues that make them incompatible with the letters that we know to be authentically of Paul. Still, they have great value to us because they provide excellent historical framework for the events going on in the church of that time. Even if the writings, these last writings, are not Paul's, it certainly shows the growing concern for maintaining true doctrine and right behavior. As we in the newspaper, in the Week in Religion, I've been doing a series on how we got our views on the Holy Spirit. And what is becoming increasingly evident in last week and in this coming week is that there is now becoming major breaks in church understanding of theology as the church develops in its early stages. They were questioning, what is this Trinity? How does it operate? Who are they? Are they persons? Is it one? Is it? And then we wind up with all these different groups who are disagreeing with each other, and each one's calling the other one heretics. The guy named Arius, who wound up being the first proclaimed heretic, it would seem, writes in a letter to Eusebius, a bishop in Caesarea, and he refers to what we now call Orthodox Christians as being heretics. So everybody's throwing heretic at each other, and we can see that this is already developing before we even get out of the first century. So showing this drive for maintaining true doctrine and true behavior, true right behavior, is a very important look for us into the life of the early church. But in no way should we assume that Paul spoke of women the way he did, the way that we find in these last letters. Otherwise, Paul's admonition that there is neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, bond nor free, was a lie. And that's something that we can never believe. Was it people trying to do wrong? Absolutely not. I don't believe that at all. I think they were simply church people who were trying to use Paul's name in order to push forward what they thought to be important messages, important theology, important church practice for their time. But already we can see that there was a pushback against women in authority. Already we can see that there was that Jews and Gentiles were not in conflict within each other anymore. So it shows us a real look into the struggles of the early church and what they were fighting. And sadly, for many, 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 many years, the church will come out on the wrong side with the whole buying into the won't allow a woman to teach business, which is the most egregious thing I think that the church has put up with for a long, long, long time. Anyway, that's where we are going to leave it. Pastor Elizabeth, let's see. Pastor Elizabeth says, our English teachers don't let you get away with that long of a run-on sentence. Remember, the chat is here if you want to ask a question. Oh, well, sorry. There we go. And yeah, did I count 7 copies of a copy? Yeah, and actually, that's me being a little bit generous. It could be even farther down the road than that, but yeah.
Thank you, Travis. Actually, I was like, this is a good moment to switch to female pastor, right?
There you go. See, it was all planned.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, if you have other questions, I'm still recording this bit, and I'll ask my question or give a couple thoughts, and then we'll turn off the recording so we can have some more question and answer time. And as I was listening to you, Travis, I think a couple nuggets of like what I appreciate at the end, these letters still held value for people, right? And they're holding onto them and have teachings. And actually, I was at a preaching festival last week online, and the first presentation, it was on creation care and in care for the environment. And the first speaker used 2 Timothy 1:7, that God did not give us a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power and of love and a sound mind, is the translation she used. And she's a scientist who works on creation care with people across the political spectrum. And she said, I love this because this is everything that I am, right? And so right. Even holding on to these truths that come out that inspire us, and wanting and thanking you for the comments on women's place in this. And if folks aren't used to using sort of like a feminist critique, or if like using that language scares you, that's literally all it is saying what's going on here. Like they probably had a reaction to some women speaking up or leading in church, because when you do look at those earlier ones, women leading and having a larger role upsets the society. And you look at who carries the letters forward, who's writing, it's carried forward more by male leaders. And so this is a small example of like what a feminist reading of scripture looks like. It's asking, where are the women's voices? What's going on?
And I think it was around the year 107 that Pliny the Younger, who is the Roman governor of Bithynia, wrote a letter to the emperor explaining his problems with these Christians. And one of his criticisms was these Christians treat women as if they are equal to men. And he says that there are women teachers. And this is extraordinary. And how barbaric can these people possibly be? So that is showing that even in that year, 107 or 117, I can't remember which, we have a Roman saying, these Christians are extraordinary. Look at what they're doing. So even inside the church, while there was a struggle of women being in leadership, the Romans were pretty much astonished by it all. The outsiders were pretty amazed at all that. In Roman society, women held the power behind the scenes. They've always said that Augustus Caesar was a powerful man, but there was nobody more powerful than his wife Livia. But to have women, and so what this is showing is that Pliny is saying these guys aren't even keeping this behind closed doors. The women are leading in the community, and how extraordinary is that? I think he was amazed. But already we start to see this push, looking in Timothy, this push towards not letting women have that position. So the battle of the sexes did not begin with Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs. It was going on long before that. And in the church of all places. But you know what? And something else that tells us is that the church is also a place where social dynamics are in full play. That the things that are going on in the community are probably going on in the church too. I mean, like struggles of roles and things like that. But we have Paul referring to Junia as an apostle, and an apostle before him. Priscilla being a co-worker with Christ, and then you have Mary Magdalene. You have all these others who play such great roles, and the church will spend the next 600 years trying to crush the role of women in the church, and they will be successful for a couple of millennia, it seems like. But yeah, sorry, that's just my reading, and I'm rabid about that.
And I'd like to hear your comments on this next one too, because you're talking about in First Timothy and then in Titus a bit about what is proper behavior, right? In that conflating that in society and in the church. And when I heard you talking about this respectable behavior in church and beyond, because they were trying to maybe work on their position in society, that
Right.
what's respectable, what's respected. And the reality right now is with like the protests happening in Minneapolis after George Floyd's death this week, and that hurt and pain and rage that we see erupting, both in the nonviolent protests and then in other ways, reflects that anger and pain is in our church, and we don't, and in our context here in Clark County, may not see it as clearly. But that is another place where people have been told for generations what is respectable. And so those who have been oppressed and on the outskirts, again, who Christ-centered, who also at the time that these other letters were written, maybe might be quenching that spirit of egalitarianism as well, right. Not just women, but of all different class levels as well.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, respectable behavior is usually behavior that doesn't draw attention or cause conflict. Mm-hmm. And Christ did exactly those two things.
Amen.
He drew attention and he caused conflict. Don't ever let it be forgotten that crucifixion is a Roman penalty, and there's only one crime that befits crucifixion, and that is sedition against the empire. The Romans saw Jesus as a troublemaker and someone who had to be silenced. Now, were they prompted by the Jewish authorities? Okay, we can take that. But yeah, Jesus was a troublemaker. He was a trouble to the religious authorities. He was a trouble to the political authorities. Why? Because that's just what truth does. Because in an environment where the truth is not what's important, when lies and deceit and oppression and bigotry, when those are what best serves the ruling class, then to preach of egalitarianism and to preach of truth, well, that makes you the most dangerous person of all. And you know what? There is no male nor female, Jew nor Greek, bond nor free. And to watch our brothers and sisters being treated like we've seen them treated in the last, I don't know, since 1620. Yeah, there's a reason for us to speak truth, and there's a reason to be enraged. We can be angry and not sin. At least there's some book that told me that. And it's right to be angry. Okay, if we want to go back to Ecclesiastes, there's a time for it. There's a time to be angry. And injustice has got to be, and I'm talking about injustice against social classes, against people of different ideologies. I'm talking about injustice, meaning not being treated fairly. Then yeah, that is absolutely right cause and right reason for becoming a troublemaker.
And we are back from a question and answer time. We hashed out a little bit more on women in the church and at the time of these pastoral letters that were written, and heard Travis explaining the Greek behind Ephesians chapter 5:22 or verse 21 following, where the writer talks about women being subject to husband and husband being head, as Christ was the head of the body. And the biggest takeaway here is that usage of the word head in the Greek, continuing the militaristic language that Travis referenced before, that word head means the vanguard, the one who first encounters whatever is coming their way. And so it's not at all related to our physical bodies, but that is what society looked like at that time, where that man was, the husband was the one who encountered things first in society. And that the main point in Ephesians is to love one another. And often there and in other spaces, we get lost in gender roles or hierarchical pieces, and we lose that image of the self-sacrificial love that Paul is calling us to and that he modeled in his own life and teaching and in his letters. And that got me thinking about this afternoon, I got to hang out with a bunch of Moravians talking about the Festival of Homiletics that we attended last week. And a lot of what we've have been talking about tonight, especially where we ended conversation with Travis, was into that role of prophetic, of what it means to be prophets and to speak truth to power and to name injustice that we see. And one of the requests that we had as part of this group was to share what our definition of justice is. And so I'll share mine and ask for you to think about that too. And for me, I think about John 10:10 comes to mind, along with the images that Paul uses of Christ, of us as the body of Christ, that God's justice is about abundant life for all. And that life is for now, and it is for all people, it is for all creation, it is for all communities. And that when one member of our body hurts, we hurt with them. And especially thinking about this week in Minneapolis, where I used to live, and where the protests are taking place where my husband grew up, that we have to, and looking at myself as a cisgender white woman, thinking about these cries of our brothers and sisters of color crying out and saying, where am I causing the pain in the body of Christ as well? That's part of what it means to be the body together. Yeah, so thinking about that, how do you see God's justice at work? How are you working for that abundant life for all and that self-sacrificial love and that we saw throughout all of Paul's letters? And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Travis again for any last words and to tell us about what next series is coming our way.
Thanks very much for being with us for these 4 sessions. Hope it's been enjoyable for you. Next time, and we're going to wait a couple of weeks before we get cracking on the next one, but we're going to do a 4-part series on the Hebrew scriptures in their historical context, meaning what was going on in the rest of the world while Judaism was springing up and developing. Long before there was an Abraham, there were pyramids in Egypt. There were ziggurats in Sumeria. There were all kinds of things going on. So it's almost like we're going to be approaching this as the Hebrew scriptures. Our Old Testament in the Bible is going to not necessarily play center stage, but show where it appeared and developed alongside the other things that were going on in the world. How other religions developed. When did Buddhism spring up? When did Zoroastrianism spring up? When did monotheism begin? All of those things that sometimes we don't associate with what we call the Old Testament. Yeah, we're going to have a look at where they parallel with each other on the timeline. After that, probably in August and September, we'll do another 4-part set and talk about the New Testament in its historical setting. And there it will be Greeks and Romans and more Greeks and more Romans.